You've washed your hands more in the last few years than your grandparents did in their entire lives combined. You know what 6 feet of distance looks like without measuring it. You've memorized words like asymptomatic, transmission rate, and variant. You watched the entire planet shut its doors at the same time because of something you couldn't even see. It felt unprecedented. It wasn't. Somewhere deep in human history, before written language, before agriculture, before anyone had a word for sickness, a virus did this exact same thing. And the people who lived through it had absolutely no idea what was happening to them. This is the story of the first pandemic, or at least the first one we can actually prove. Here's the problem with answering this question. Viruses don't leave behind weapons. They don't leave behind tools. They don't carve their story into cave walls. They leave behind bones. And if you know what to look for, bones can talk. For most of human history, we had no way of knowing what ancient diseases actually were. You can look at a skeleton and see a broken leg. You can see a healed fracture. What you cannot easily see is a virus that killed someone in 11 days and left no mark on a single bone. For decades, this meant ancient pandemics were essentially invisible to science. Then, DNA sequencing changed everything. In 2015, researchers extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of Bronze Age skeletons across Europe and Asia. Teeth, it turns out, are surprisingly good time capsules. The dense material protects genetic material far longer than soft tissue ever could. What they found inside those teeth was the genetic fingerprint of Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria responsible for the Black Death. Except this wasn't medieval Europe. This was roughly 5,000 years ago. Let that sit for a second. The disease that would later kill a third of Europe's population in the 1300s was already circulating among humans nearly 5,000 years earlier. Different strain, different era, same brutal pathogen, just getting started. These early humans had no concept of bacteria, no concept of contagion in the way we understand it. No quarantine procedures, no antibiotics that wouldn't exist for thousands of years. What they had was something getting sick, and people around that something also getting sick, and absolutely no framework for understanding why. But here's where the story gets stranger. That Bronze Age strain of plague was missing a key genetic component that the medieval version had. Specifically, it lacked the mutation that allows the bacteria to survive inside fleas and get transmitted through flea bites. Which means the ancient version probably couldn't spread the way the medieval Black Death did. It likely spread directly between people, through breath, through contact, through the air in a crowded space. Researchers now believe this early strain may have moved through ancient communities the way respiratory illnesses do, the way something more recent and more familiar also did. Now, here's a question almost nobody asks. Why does this matter for understanding human history at all? Because around the same time this ancient plague was circulating, something massive was happening across Europe and Asia. Entire populations were moving, migrating, and in some cases, vanishing. For decades, archaeologists were confused by something called the Yamnaya expansion, a massive population movement roughly 5,000 years ago that completely reshaped the genetic makeup of Europe in a remarkably short period of time. Some researchers now believe disease may have played a role in clearing the path. Weakened populations, collapsed communities. Spaces left open for new groups to move into. We cannot know this with certainty, but the timeline lines up in a way that should make you uncomfortable. Here's the part of this that doesn't get talked about enough. Ancient humans had zero understanding of what was killing them. No germ theory, no concept of invisible organisms. When sickness spread through a group, the only explanation available was supernatural. Anger from spirits, a curse, punishment from something unseen. Archaeological evidence from this period shows an explosion in ritual burial practices. Bodies buried with unusual care. Bodies buried separately from others. Some buried with what appear to be protective objects. This wasn't superstition for its own sake. This was the only tool humans had to process something completely incomprehensible. A response to chaos they had no scientific language to explain. In a strange way, it's the same instinct that made people clap for healthcare workers from balconies a few years ago. Different century. Same fundamental need to do something in the face of something invisible and terrifying. But here's where this story shifts from frightening to remarkable. Despite having none of the tools we have today, ancient humans survived. not just individually, as a species. Multiple waves of ancient disease swept through prehistoric populations, and humanity kept going. Some of that survival came down to pure brutal numbers. Smaller, more spread out populations meant disease had a harder time finding new hosts. Hunter-gatherer groups were rarely large enough to sustain an epidemic for long before either burning out or running out of people to infect. But some of it came down to something more interesting: genetic adaptation. Modern genome studies have found specific genetic markers in European populations that appear to have been shaped by ancient plague exposure. Variants that may have offered slight survival advantages against infection. Genes that got selected for generation after generation because the people who had them were more likely to survive whatever was moving through their communities. You are walking around today with genetic information that was, in part, written by diseases that existed before the pyramids were built. So what actually happened during humanity's first known pandemic? We don't have a complete story. We never will. The people who lived through it left no written record, no explanation, no warning for the future. What they left was their DNA, preserved by accident in ancient teeth, waiting 5,000 years for someone with the right tools to finally listen to what those bones had been trying to say the entire time. They got sick in ways they couldn't explain. They lost people they couldn't save. They buried their dead with whatever ritual meaning they could find in a situation that made no logical sense to them. And they kept going. Every single person watching this video right now exists because somewhere in that ancient chain, enough people survived long enough to keep the line going. The plague didn't end humanity. It just became one more thing humanity quietly outlasted. And if that made you think about the last few years a little differently, that's exactly what Odd Ape is here for. Every week we go looking for the questions hiding underneath the questions everyone is already asking. Ancient humans, animal psychology, the strange science of being alive. If that's your kind of thing, subscribe. It's free.